I know this thing is on, and I know that you can hear me. Nursing and healthcare needs advocates and activism. So what are you waiting for? Let's do the damn thing. As nurses, we know that patient care doesn't stop at the hospital doors. We work side by side with some of the most dedicated and essential members of the healthcare team, which are caregivers. These are partners, family members, and friends who provide critical, round the clock support, often without a handbook or a break. But who is supporting them? Did you know that about 4 million people in Ontario care for a friend, parent, family member, or a neighbor? Well, in this episode, we're going to talk about and get to the heart of the question about caregiving. I'd like to introduce Amie Coupal to the show. Amie Coupal is the CEO of the Ontario Caregiver organization. She has a Master's of Education from the University of Calgary and is an elder trained coach. With over 20 years of experience in the nonprofit sector, she's passionate about making a positive impact in the lives of individuals and communities. Amie has a deep personal understanding of caregiving and has been a caregiver for most of her life. She's cared for her brother who had cerebral palsy, supported her mother through a cancer journey, and currently provides support to her elderly father. Welcome, Amie, to the show. 4 million. That's a lot of people. And I bet you, there's probably even more people that are still providing care in various different ways that might have not even self-identified. Because I think one of the things is most people might not even see themselves as a caregiver. I remember thinking about the fact that when I had my episode about the midlife squeeze, it like hits 40 and all of a sudden now I'm taking care of my parents. It's such a weird shift, but it's an important shift that we have to talk about. So before we get into the nitty gritty of the conversation, let's talk a little bit about your organization. Would you mind providing an overview about what your organization does?
Sure. So the Ontario Caregiver Organization supports Ontario's 4 million caregivers. That number is going to grow, by the way. So you're quite right that there are more people out there. We anticipate that there will be 6.5 million people by
Wow.
2030, which is just around the corner. And these are regular people, family members, friends, and neighbors who are supporting someone around physical or mental health. And what I can say from my own experience, and certainly in working with caregivers, is that there really are no two caregiving experiences that are exactly the same.
Right.
So caregiving evolves over time. It might be things like booking appointments or going to an appointment with someone. It might be supporting medication management, but it can also be much more active and time intensive kinds of things where people are actually doing paramedical tasks at home, helping with a wide range of tasks associated with a daily living. And it may change over time based on the needs of the person that they're caring for. And it usually doesn't go in a straight line. So, there may be times if someone is going in and out of hospital or their healthcare needs are changing, that caregiving can become more or less intense. It's not always predictable.
I completely agree with that in terms of how the shift may change. I think there's a lot of things that we could talk about in terms of, just the fact that workplaces need to do a little bit of a better job when it comes to providing support for their employees that might have to take time off because they're being an essential caregiver. I think that, one of the biggest things I've noticed for is it's hard to ask for help. Like I haven't even asked for help. I feel like I'm not there yet. But what is the sense and what would you tell people about when people should reach out to get some help or know or even self-identify that it's like, okay, I think I need a little bit more support here.
Well, this is really where an organization like ours comes in. And you asked about what we do, and I think that we want to make sure that we have something for everybody. So whether you're calling yourself a caregiver or whether you're saying, "Oh, I'm just, helping my parents who are becoming older and they need more support," we have something here for you. So people can find lots of information on our website at ontariocaregiver.ca. There's lots of checklists or toolkits that people can use at specific stages of their caregiving journey. But we'll also do things like connect caregivers with a peer mentor who's maybe had a similar type of experience, or you may want to join a peer support group or one of our education series where we're digging into topics that may be relevant for you, maybe specific caregiving tasks, or maybe some of the financial or legal considerations associated with helping someone who may have physical or mental health needs. So an organization like ours exists to help people no matter where they are in the caregiving journey. And we want lots of points of entry. So you might call our 24/7 helpline, you might visit our website or sign up for one of our programs. And I think that the time that people can determine what they need is as early as possible and related to the support that they're looking for now. So is it that you need a plan? Is it that you need a plan out of a really tight situation? Is it that you don't want to feel so alone? So, I think we have a lot of people who find themselves in these caregiving circumstances without maybe anticipating it. Maybe there was an accident, or maybe we just didn't have some of those conversations in advance. But knowing that you're a caregiver and knowing that there are organizations like ours out there can make a difference in how you navigate that journey.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. We don't know what we don't know, right? And I think that it's so important to highlight the fact that there are resources and that there is support and there is help out there. Because I mean, as a nurse, it's a part of our health teaching too, right? To say here's some of the resources that you might need, because we see the patients when they're coming in and then at discharge, and it's a part of that kind of early planning. So I think it should be kind of almost tip of the tongue to say here's an excellent resource if you're going to be going back out in the community, and now you might need, for example, like you said, maybe it's an accident, maybe it's just a new diagnosis. But even for us to have that language to say, here's another place that we could point people for help and support. One of the things that I was looking at in terms of just trying to understand a little bit more about some of the work that you do is looking at where there might be gaps, right? So what would you say some of the biggest gaps there are right now in terms of support for caregivers in Ontario, and how would your organization work to address them?
So I would say one of the gaps is actually related to inconsistency. So people can go to one type of healthcare provider or one type of organization and have one experience, and in another have something very, very different. So one of the gaps that we're working on filling is really generating more consistency for caregivers across their experience in the healthcare system. So I would use our essential care partner work as an example of this. The ECP Support Hub, what we are doing is working with hospitals, long-term care homes, home and community care, primary care, to really build on leading practices in 3 key areas. First is around identification of caregivers and helping them to see that you may be doing something more than being, just a daughter or a spouse or a parent. Then it's also about recognizing them as a part of the care team. And that may be around things like transition planning, for example. The number of times that caregivers tell us they are not included in the creation of a transition plan that hinges on them tells us
Right.
that this is an important place that we need to do some work. And then the last piece is connecting caregivers with support that's just for them. So we want to unbundle caregivers from patients, clients, or residents. Both are important, but they're not the same. So
Right.
caregivers have their own unique role, and we want to make sure that through organizations like ours, through supports within the local healthcare setting and the local community, caregivers get the support that they need to do what they want to do, but also balance that, as you pointed out, with all of the other things that are going on in their life.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think like we could do a way better job in, hospitals or even in community settings where we're kind of really working together. And I know there's so many silos in healthcare, and particularly the area that I worked at a hospital. And yeah, that's probably the most challenging piece. I'm kind of diverging here. I do want to speak to a little bit of the culture between, nurses and essential caregivers. Because I remember during the pandemic, it actually became more of a thing within the hospital setting, where we talked about, of course, we always had patients and families come in, but they were taking on more work, more of a critical lens in terms of helping and supporting the patient, particularly while we were going through the pandemic. But there was always this kind of like, I don't want to say clash or butting heads, but there was always this kind of unspoken language between, let's say it was the care provider and the essential care, the family member who's actually helping support. What would you say to, so now I'm asking you to speak to nurses and other allied healthcare members of the team. How can we bridge that gap? Because that's probably one of the the things that I think a lot of folks struggle with. It's just the fact that, okay, yes, we have the patient that's coming in, we're looking after the patient, but their family is a huge part of that journey. And how do we ensure that there's some balance there, right? And that we also, yes, we're looking after the patient, but we know the patient's going to be discharged. How do we continue to look after the family as well? And how do we bridge that little headbutting that we might see?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I would want to do is recognize the reality of that experience for people that you've just described. So I'm not going to pretend that that isn't a thing that we hear
Right.
from our healthcare provider colleagues and also that we hear from caregivers, right? But what we also know is that caregivers are providing the vast majority of care, right? Whether that is at home or in other environments. And this may not be specific medical tasks, but they
Right.
are helping that person in a wide range of ways related to their physical and mental health, as well as their emotional, spiritual wellness, or whatever the case may be. So I think recognizing the role that caregivers are playing is the starting point. Then it is a culture shift, right? That we are actually on the same team. We are
Right.
part of this circle of care, just like you recognized a wide range of allied health professionals, right? We are part of this circle of care together with this patient partner, resident partner, client partner, whatever it may be. And so, how do we respect each other's roles? How do we make sure that everyone has the support and resources that they need in order to play that role successfully? And how do we work together? And I think, what caregivers are looking for is that recognition, also that inclusion, right? And part of that is the communication and engagement that's required behind that. Caregivers feel often like an afterthought, but whatever ends up happening, they're the ones who need to know. And they are, in
Right.
many ways, often the keeper of the history, right? And sometimes
Yep.
the records, the people who are actually porting information around when the systems aren't interoperable. So there's a value piece there for caregivers, and there are mechanisms that we can work on that will actually engage them in that dialogue in a way that everybody can be more effective, where we can manage risk, right?
Yep.
Caregivers are actually great risk managers, and
Yes.
they can be seen as valuable in that way. But believe me, caregivers don't want to play the role of the healthcare professional. They want to respect that role of the healthcare professional and work together, having their role as a caregiver respected.
I agree with that. And I think that's so important that you said that, right? It's mutual respect because again, each player has something that they're bringing to the team that maybe the other person is unaware of. And I think it's so important that we see it that way, that we see it as a collaboration and as a team effort. I do want to talk a little bit about gender roles. Particularly, I don't know. I didn't look at if you have any stats posted, probably not. But I'm going to make an assumption, and I know what my mom would say to me about assumptions. I'm not going to repeat it. I'm sure you probably know what that is as well. But one of the things that I'm going to assume is that most of the people who probably come to your organization are women. One of the things that I noticed about even just caregiving in my family and just, working as a nurse and seeing who that caregiving role is, it typically tends to be a woman. And that I know adds a little bit more stress and burden to the rest of all of the different things that we're trying to manage, whether it's work, whether we have kids, finances, job promotions, various different things like that. What would you say to, because again, caregiving roles should not be specific to a gender whatsoever. Do you have any strategies to reach out to say to men or other folks to say, hey, you can and are a caregiver as well? And then are there specific resources specific to women to help support them in this particular type of role? Because we do see more women in the caregiving role, so to speak.
So let's talk about some of the practicalities around women in caregiving. The gender split around caregiving is relatively balanced between women
Oh,
and men. But
okay.
when you start to dig one level or more deeper, then you understand women are often spending more time on their caregiving responsibility. They're paying a greater penalty financially and in terms of job opportunities. So I don't want to minimize what you just said about the impact of caregiving on women. We also know that in different cultural communities, there will be an absolute expectation that a female within the family will take on more of a caregiving role than other
Right.
male siblings, right? So there can be cultural norms and expectations in place around who will be the caregiver for mom, dad, in-laws, whatever the case may be. So this is a real challenge, and we do know that there is a huge cohort of caregivers, which you've already talked about in the sandwich generation. I'm one of them, where you have kids at home and parents or whomever they may be who are older adults, and you're balancing work, care, parenting, and all the other things that are important to you in your life. And so I think part of it is to acknowledge that most caregivers are juggling a lot. That's what they're coming into when they show up in your
Right.
ER, your waiting room, whatever the case may be, the other end of the phone. They are probably trying to keep all the pieces of the puzzle together when they get to you. And
Right.
they're looking for help, right? Looking for help to make it easier so that they can fulfill this commitment that they've made as a caregiver, but they don't want the other balls to drop either, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
so I think that this is where tools and strategies for caregivers, simple things like tip sheets, connecting with someone who's been through this before and can help accelerate your learning, where
Right.
having a caregiver coach who can help you create a plan for your particular circumstances, those kinds of things can really make a difference. But the other thing I hear consistently that caregivers need, and this applies to women and otherwise, is they want to know that they are not alone. To have it normalized that you're not the only one out there in the world who's balancing all these things, and that it
Right.
is a lot, and that people need support, whether you are a sandwich generation, perhaps you're an older adult mutual caregiver, that caregiving comes with considerations around how you make it work within your life and for your own health and wellness.
I think you're right in terms of the fact that it's so multifaceted, right? And caregiver burnout is a thing.
It
And I
is.
think it's okay for people to say, I'm struggling, I need help. And I think that it's so hard, right? We're still working on this language where people feel open and vulnerable enough to say, like, I'm struggling, I'm drowning, I need a little bit of help because, right, like you said, I'm in that sandwich generation too, where it's just like I can't put my teenage boys in front of a screen and just leave them unencumbered while I look after, like my parents, and then I have like a newborn, which is another wild situation. But you're right. I think people have to be able to give themselves that grace to say, you know what, this is a lot. And to, like I'm glad to hear it because I'm going to be sending people your way that there are other people that are experiencing this, that this is not something that they have to experience in a vacuum all by themselves. And there are other people that they can talk to, have these conversations about to say that, yeah, I'm feeling a little bit squeezed and just hear me out. Let's have a conversation. Let's talk about what is actually going on. So I'm glad to hear that that's some of the work that you're doing. I want to go back to where you talked about some cultural considerations, because that's another question that I was going to ask. So, how does your organization tailor its support to specific communities, whether it's the 2S LGBTQIA plus Black, Indigenous, or even young caregivers? That's another one that kind of came up. So, my husband's a social worker, and there are instances where you know a young child is actually the primary caregiver. So, how does your organization help with those various different groups?
Yeah, it's a great question. So folks from who identify with any one or more of those groups that you just named should be able to go to our website, put in a search, and find resources and information that's for them. So that's an important place to start. We've
Right.
worked in concert with caregivers from different communities with different identities, from an intersectional perspective, to really tailor resources and supports based on those needs. So let's just start with that. And then I think it's also important to acknowledge that the experiences and needs of individuals from different communities are not the same, right? We
Right.
hear from caregivers around how bias, how discrimination, how inequitable practices, challenges related to the social determinants of health, all of those things are impacting their caregiving experiences. So again, I just
Right.
want to really acknowledge that we hear this every day and that it is borne out in the research as well. So we
Right.
have some of those custom resources. One of the things that we did last year was a great project in collaboration with folks from different communities creating custom versions of our I Am a Caregiver toolkit. And we worked on that. We have it out in 7 different languages. We have an LGBTQ plus version. We have a Black caregiver version. We have lots of different versions of those toolkits that have been created based on the needs and nuances within those communities. So I think that's an important place to start. I also want to talk about young caregivers, because I think sometimes this still comes as a surprise to people. And as a former young caregiver and somebody who's been steeped in this work, I will tell you, there are young people far younger than any of us would like to acknowledge who are doing things like giving
Medications,
mom,
yeah.
grandpa, whomever, medication,
Yep.
needles, you know, planning their school, their work, all of those things around their caregiving responsibilities for siblings, for parents, for multi-generational families. Those young people are out there. And it is something, I know here we're talking about this in terms of nurses and other healthcare providers, but it is a really important conversation to have with educators,
Right.
because it is affecting whether you're in, grade school, high school, post-secondary, whatever the case may be, caregivers out there too. So I think this comes back to the point that caregiving can show up at any stage of your life for
Right.
anybody from any background. And we cannot assume that people are having the same kinds of experiences, and we have some really important work to continue to do to overcome some of those biases and barriers that are affecting people in their experience when they are interacting with healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, I have to be honest. Everything that you said makes my heart sore because I'm just like, it's so important that organizations look towards making sure that the work that they're doing is not just diverse, not just inclusive, but is intersectional. So I'm so glad to hear that, you're on that journey and that you're aware of some of the challenges that are faced by other different communities. So that's hugely important to me. If you could speak to any political leaders or all of our political leaders, what would you want to tell them about the Ontario Caregiver Organization, or how might they be able to help or better support your needs or support caregivers' needs, I should say?
I think I would want them to know the same thing that I want everybody to know, which is caregivers are in your midst. They are down the hall, they are down the street, they are in line with you at the store, and it's often invisible in that way. But caregiving is affecting everything in terms of caregivers' capacities to work, to participate in our community in the ways that they want to, right? In the
Right.
way that they access healthcare. But caregivers are propping up a lot in our society in terms of helping people to stay at home, helping people to stay well, oftentimes helping to make sure that people don't have to show up at the ER because they don't have any other choice. And
Right.
so I think we need to recognize the value that caregivers bring in our society and how that is actually something that needs to be supported in ways that are going to make a difference in the lives of caregivers to be able to continue to provide care. And as we look at more and more caregivers taking on this role with changes in our demographics, but also with increases in chronic illness, we
Right.
have to support caregivers so that they can continue to do it because they want to, right?
Yeah, they
And
do.
I'll disagree with myself a little bit on the want to piece, because I also want to acknowledge those people who are doing it because they have to. And
Mm.
there are people who are providing care and it isn't their first choice. I think it's important to recognize that there are people in terms of their role within the family. We certainly hear from people who are caring for former spouses because they're the only
Wow.
one. And so when we come back to this question of, caregivers and evolving the relationship, it's important to know that people are bringing all that baggage behind them to the conversation, and we don't know what they're bringing when they're at the
Right.
other end of the phone or they're next to that person, right?
I think having that greater awareness and understanding that you said they can be your neighbor, they're down the hall from you, understanding that, it's an everyday person. Anybody can be put into the
Anybody.
situation where they're in a caregiving role. And I think that, people have to realize that and acknowledge that. And I think that the government should do more to support people if they do have to take a leave. I know that there are some people that had to mortgage their homes because, they're dealing with financial strain with caregiving and different things like that. So I think it's important that we have that greater awareness at that political level to also, facilitate and see change and to support organizations like yours who are doing this type of work. So lastly, so I have two questions. So what are your key priorities? And if you can, is there a success story that you would love to share?
Yeah, great questions. So maybe we'll start with priorities. My biggest priority is that all caregivers across the province of Ontario are able to connect with the support that they need from us, but also other organizations. One of the things that we do is we connect caregivers with support locally and regionally if they're not already connected with those things. So
Right,
we know that caregivers need lots of different things, and we can't provide all of it, but we want to help to support those connections if we're not the one to give it. So if we can reduce some of that loneliness and isolation for caregivers where they feel like they're going at it alone, that's great. Another major priority for me is getting to caregivers sooner. We know, and you acknowledged this right from the outset, that we have people where there's a generation of folks in their lives who are aging as we all are, but where they're
right,
starting to get into that place where they may need more support. Having a plan is so important. Having those uncomfortable conversations is so important. Managing people's expectations about what do I think you're going to do? What are you not prepared to do?
right,
Happens if plan A doesn't unfold? Do we have a plan B? It is vital that we have those conversations, or as you pointed out around burnout, the burnout rates, which are already pretty problematic, are going to get worse. And I would
right.
really like to do things to both reduce the existing burnout rate and how quickly people are getting to burnout, which is getting faster and faster, but also to reduce the amount of burnout that people are experiencing, right?
Right now, I think there's just so much going on in the world, just in
Yeah.
general, right? That having a sense of community and knowing that you're not alone is so important. I think back to some conversations I've had with my husband. Like I said, he's a social worker, but he did his undergraduate in philosophy and English, where he'd be like, we had societies of people where all of the things that we did were communal. So you weren't looking after, your mom or your grandma by yourself. It was your community that was looking after after all of these. So it was never something that you were doing alone. He's like, it would be very rewarding if we ever got back to the state where that we've begged for individualism, we've begged for technology, but some of these things are really not helping, and we need to build connection, and we need to be able to reach out for support and not feel alone. So I'm glad that there is the Ontario Caregiver organization. I think that you're doing great work, and I'm going to happily point people in your direction. And lastly, do you have a little success story or that you're willing to share or that you can share?
Well, the good news is I have a lot of those. And,
Yay!
the common theme is the stories without, identifying any individuals often follow the same kind of formula. I really felt like I was alone in some way, perhaps for a sustained period of time. And then I connected with your organization and I got connected with the resources that I needed. And
Right,
that often includes a human connection, right? It might have been a one-time phone call to our helpline, but it also might be, my peer support, which is now my lifeline, or a period of
right,
coaching that helped me to create a plan. What we hear from people in the vast majority of cases is that when they have that, it is a turnaround point for them. And at the end of the day, it probably doesn't change the scope of things that they're doing, but we can actually help people to have that make a difference in their lives. And I met with a caregiver not that long ago who was coming to talk about her experience in caregiving on one of our committees. And she said, I'm in my car right now from the mall because the plan that we created was this is how I was going to get a break. She ended up getting eligible for respite in her community. And she said, I don't even like going to the mall, but I'm trying to do things that normal people do. And I put
right,
on makeup today and I got myself dressed and I'm going to go and do that because it's going to be a thing that makes me feel normal during this period of time that I have with my eligible respite. That is
right.
the difference for her in terms of feeling like she is stuck in a situation that she can't sustain to, you know what? I went and did this thing that was important just for me. And I'm not saying
Right.
going to the mall is the answer, but for her, that was the answer.
But that's her. actually taking power back, right? When we
Right.
feel that we're powerless in these situations, that's a form of taking power back.
Right. So, it can feel often for caregivers like there are no options and no choices. So what we want
Right.
to do is unpack, what does that look like for you? Might be one small piece one time, it may be a bigger plan, but let's break it down in some kind of digestible chunk and move from there. And if nothing else, let's do it with you, right?
Yes.
And that is where we see the success stories time and time again from caregivers, truly.
You got me. I'm sold. No, I think what you're doing is amazing work and needed work. And I think that, the takeaway point for me, just personally, is to reach out for help sooner rather than later. Cause again, I think there's that reluctance. I could feel it. I feel it even just as I'm talking to you. Cause like I do have my parents that I'm looking after. My dad had recently had a cancer diagnosis, and it's just so much change. And I'm just kind of like, I think I'm okay. I think I'm okay. But maybe it's time to reach out.
Well, and here's the thing I will say, and you're an interesting one to talk to about this because you have the personal caregiving experience and you have the professional healthcare experience.
Right.
I understand that there can be challenging times between healthcare providers and caregivers. I'm not going to pretend that that doesn't happen. But the caregivers that I talk to, they have such a deep appreciation for healthcare providers, and they know that that relationship is important and that they want to cultivate that. They just want to be included in that. So I think it's also important in a world where sometimes healthcare providers take some knocks out there. Let's not kid ourselves. That
Right.
that what we're working on here is, how do we do this together? Because that really productive relationship with a caregiver actually makes everybody.
Yep.
You can focus on the things you need to do for your job. A caregiver can do the things that they need to do in their caregiving role, and the patient or resident or client has the best experience.
Yep.
So we're really focused on that win-win-win kind of formula. And I think it's just important to recognize, in circumstances where I know healthcare providers are navigating a lot, that we want to do the kinds of things we're talking about here in collaboration and in a way that works for everybody.
Right. We need to feel that synergy, and I don't believe it's an impossible ask. I definitely
No,
think it's something that's absolutely doable. So before we leave, I always ask this question: is there anything that we missed or anything that we haven't touched on in this episode?
I want to come back to something that you touched on earlier around work. And
Yes.
we didn't talk about this in terms of some of the things that we're doing, but I think it's important to highlight this. The vast majority of caregivers work. And we're looking at this in two ways. How do we support caregivers in having the conversations that they need to have with their employers based on their own unique circumstances in their job? Because this is
Right.
definitely not one size fits all. But how do we also work with employers around caregiver friendly policies and practices? And there are some really interesting innovations happening in certain healthcare organizations right now where people are recognizing double duty caregivers, which is
Mm.
exactly somebody like you, where you're a healthcare provider and you're a family caregiver. And
Right.
so there's some good work that's happening. There's more work that has to happen in that area. We're actively involved with that, working with some of our health system partners and developing resources and supports for double duty caregivers. But I think that's another piece to underscore is caregiving is often happening on the backdrop of lots of responsibilities, and people need to
Right.
put food on the table and pay for rent or mortgage or whatever it is. And double duty caregivers, folks who may be listening to you, they have another level of complexity, and we need to make sure that we are supporting them in
Right.
in being able to balance those things.
No, I think you're right, because I think to myself, it's just like, okay, if you've done an 11.25 shift and you come home and you're still carrying, and then you sleep, and then you go back to work to do another, it's literally I would say that you could be doing 18 plus hours of
Yeah.
caregiving. It's challenging. I think you're right. And I think that that's a huge conversation that organizations need to have. The double duty caregiver. I almost kind of want to write an op-ed. We got to stay in touch.
We'll chat.
I'm
We'll
do
chat.
I'm doing some work with hospital news, so maybe we could write an op-ed, because I think that's a perfect opportunity to shine that light on double duty caregivers and talk to other hospitals and be like, "Hey, this organization's doing some great work. How about we, take that and translate it over to each organization. Because again, I don't know why hospitals do things in silos. It's like, here's a policy that works for this patient population, but for whatever reason, everyone does something different. Well, let's try to get all on the same page. And I think this would be a great opportunity to, do a little bit more work and dig into that. Cause I think that's something that's well needed right across the board, or right across all hospitals in Canada, that we should have that conversation, particularly because we've been talking about nursing burnout, healthcare burnout. It's a huge thing and it's not getting any better. So we need to talk about how we can have policies that support the workers that are there caregiving and going home to caregive as well. So
Happy to continue that conversation anytime.
for sure, yes, we will be connected. So thank you so much, Amie, for coming on the Green Nurse podcast. This was a wonderful discussion about caregivers and essential caregivers and how we can continue to have the conversation and for people to know that, there is help and support available. So thank you for taking the time today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Looking for a great gift for a nurse or someone who needs to learn about nursing? Check out my national best-selling book, The Wisdom of Nurses, Stories of Grit from the Bedside. Thank you so much for listening to The Gritty Nurse with Amie Archibald-Varley. If you're watching on YouTube or listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or any other podcast platform, please hit the subscribe button so you'll never miss out on any awesome episodes from The Gritty Nurse. Thank you so much and stay tuned until next time. Stay gritty.